This episode of the CUInsight Experience is brought to you by Humanidei. Humanidei helps credit unions build inclusive cultures that attract, develop, and retain talent. Welcome to Season 4 of the CUInsight Experience, episode 126. Crazy. That's a lot of conversations I've had. I'm Randy Smith, one of the co-founders of CUInsight.com, and I am so excited to have you here today. This show is all about taking a deep dive with the leaders of the credit union movement that make it so great. Today, I get to have a conversation with Jill Nowacki. Jill is the president and CEO of Humanidei in O'Rourke. Jill also happens to be my human, and we're having this conversation on a Sunday night at the island of our kitchen in West Hartford, Connecticut. So let's just jump right in, kick off season 4 of the podcast. Jill, welcome back to the show, my love. Thanks for helping me kick off another season, and I get to try out some new questions on you. You can tell me if they suck.
Well, thank you for having me, Randy. I'm excited to be back with you.
And you had to come so far.
Right.
I mean, we had to come downstairs. You just put Cross to bed. So anyways, I'd like to start out with you telling us some of your story. Where did your career start, and how did that lead you to where you are today in credit unions?
Yeah, thank you. So my career started pretty much with credit unions. I did have a brief stint at the American Red Cross right out of college, and wanted to get back to Helena, Montana, where I had gone to college. And so I am one of the few people who answered a newspaper classified ad.
A newspaper?
And lucked out that a person who had had a college internship with happened to be neighbors with Tracy Kenyon. So when I put my name in for that, I had somebody to vouch for me that I had some good work ethic. And so I started out in marketing with Montana's credit unions. And, I
have to stop you for 1 second. Tracy's been a guest on the show, so everybody should listen to hers too. You got to cross promote a little bit since you were in marketing, right? So
that's great.
All right, now you can move on.
Yeah. So 2 decades condensed and concise into something. I think that first job stirred a passion for me in credit unions, and definitely made me feel like I found my home. I found my people in the credit union system. And so it made a lot of sense to me that over the course of the time they came, I really focused on continuing to build up and invest in getting the people right in credit unions. And that's what my career today is really all about.
So where did Humanidei come from?
Humanidei came from a deep desire after 20 years of working in the credit union space and really loving credit unions as potential tools to eradicate global poverty, but recognizing that credit unions can only get their mission right. They can only compete in this commoditized financial services place if they get the people side right. And, we all have our strengths. And to talk about that, I feel like I get people. I understand that side of it. I'm super passionate about it. And so to be able to build a career that is entirely focused on helping get the people in credit unions further developed, further brought into it, it was my calling. And that's where Humanidei came from.
I can tell everybody out there, Jill does love people. She is deeply curious about people. This may not shock people, even much more than I am. So, this was something I thought it would just be a little bit fun to start the show. Do you remember the first time you either heard of a credit union or you actually knew what one was? And I want to say, this comes from a conversation just from when I started working in credit unions, and going back home to Metro Detroit, everybody thought that credit unions had something to do with the union, right? Because you had the big three in Detroit. So it was all the UAW and the union. So I'm always intrigued by, do you remember when you knew what a credit union was?
Yeah, I knew what a credit union was. And I actually just recently got to tell this story because I had the great opportunity to speak at my hometown credit union's strategic planning session back in October. So shout out to Brooke Van Fleet at Inroads Credit Union for having me come.
And I think your brother Gordy is actually on the, is it the supervisory committee?
Yeah.
So he was at the meeting as well, right?
Yeah, that's
so that had to be
whole
something.
podcast on its own, right? When little sister gets to go and be the professional expert speaking in front of her big brother at an event, right? But
awesome.
But it did cause me to, so of course, with that being my hometown credit union, it caused me to reminisce a little bit, and I was able to to tell them all the story that the first time I remember knowing what a credit union was, we were playing, front yard wiffle ball softball with the neighbors, and the neighbor girl, who was about a year younger than me, came out wearing this I'm a Bertha Bear Cub member. And I was like, wait, she's part of a club that I'm not part of. And it was the credit union's youth savings account program.
That's
and
hilarious.
I wanted so much to be part of that and to have a savings account there. But we didn't have savings accounts as children, actually. So something I've changed, and now Crosby is certainly a credit union member today.
He is a member of Nutmeg, if I remember correctly.
That's
so
right.
saving clubs back then, that's fantastic. I did not have a saving club either. So let's stick with credit unions here. What has you most excited about our movement as you look forward? And I'd love to hear what you're working on, and what's that thing, or what do you think most credit unions should be thinking about right now, planning for going forward?
Yeah. So obviously, spoiler alert with the first answer I gave on the question, but the people. So, that's my thing, and that's what I'm passionate about. And I just got done, or kind of wrapped a bit of a project I was working on with some career path planning for one of my clients. And it's been interesting to me to see, obviously succession planning is important. I think if we doubted that at all, or if we were ambivalent to it, what we've seen with career transitions in the last 6 months has certainly spotlighted that need. But, well that Humanidei, one of the services we do is voice of the employee research. So focus groups with employees about creating inclusive organizations. And we hear constantly that one of the ways that even in the best run organizations, one of the ways that employees feel like maybe they're not being ideally included is if they don't have a clear career path. And so working with clients to really help them clarify career paths and clarify that growth, that's been incredibly rewarding and so much fun. And it's been a project that we've had the opportunity to do in an increasing amount recently as well.
I'd actually like to dig more into that. I didn't know the direction you were going. You planned this whole thing, right? But so I see a flip side to that, I guess, and not in a negative in any way, but the idea that the employee obviously wants to have a great idea of how they're doing that. How about bringing along the senior leadership team so that they're creating that culture also, that there is a career path that's going up? I mean, and I can think about that from a CUInsight level, but many credit unions are small also. So to be able to have that place for team members to grow. This is one of these scratch my own itch questions, right? Can you expand on that, I guess, a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Part of what goes into really clear career path planning is it links or it correlates really closely with this idea of really clear performance feedback too. So I'm sure that there are people who are listening right now when I say this are going to cringe because they're either the person who gave the feedback or they remember when they got the feedback, where somebody says, all right, so let's think about a senior leader, for example. And the senior leader says, all right, I'd like to become a CEO at some point. I want to be a CEO. And the person they're talking to, you presume, is the current CEO. They're speaking to that CEO to say, how can I get your job? How can I follow you? I know it's going to be 3 years or 5 years, or maybe I'm even going to have to go to a different organization. And when feedback comes in and it's something like, you just need more time. Well, what the heck is more time going to do? Because it depends on how you use that time, that matters, right? Just sitting in your chair at your desk in the same place for another 3 years isn't going to get you there. So what is it that'll get you there? What are the skills? What are the competencies? Is it more education? So when I talk about this idea of this really clear career path planning, we actually have developed a worksheet that goes into it so that regardless of where you are in the organization, you identify that next step you want, and somebody works with you and says, all right, here are the functional skills that you need, but also the competencies. Maybe a competency is more candid communication. Maybe it's emotional intelligence. Maybe it's public speaking that comes across in that. But really being able to define that and say that, and then put up all right, if your competency you need to develop is public speaking, then what is the organization going to do to invest in you so that you can improve your public speaking, instead of just being like, well, hopefully you learn how to be more professional in the time that comes, which is so often. That's when I said people are going to cringe, because I'm sure there are people who have said, just more time, just your executive presence, just like these are terms that when somebody hears that, if they don't know, that's not actionable feedback. They don't know what to do with it. And then they see somebody else get promoted and not them. And it's really easy to look at that and say, is that because I'm female? Is that because of my age? Is that like, what is it that wasn't there? But when we can give that clear, concise feedback, it's helpful in creating more inclusive organizations, and it's helpful in actually getting people to move forward. In small organizations, this matters too, because maybe your CEO is 35 and you're 32, and you're not likely to step into that CEO role when they retire. But I think and of course I'm in a different position, so I can worry about the well-being of the credit union industry as a whole. Right. So I'm like, yeah, you invest in this and that person may go become the CEO of another credit union somewhere. And maybe you lose the talent in your organization, but the system still gets it. And so I can look at that from a really benevolent perspective that maybe not everyone shares.
Right. That's true. You said something in there that actually led into my last question when you were just giving examples. And it was like, maybe you need to be better at public speaking. And the question that I have is, and like I said, a lot of these are scratch my own itch questions, and this happens to be one of them. And it's that one of the things I've loved over the past 3 years of this podcast is I literally just get to pick people's brains and ask these type of questions. And I heard this question someplace else, and it was asked of Warren Buffett. And it was, what was the greatest investment that you made in your career? And you mentioned maybe somebody needs public speaking. His answer was a Dale Carnegie speaking course. What's the greatest investment Jill has made in her career?
See, so this is a tough one where the behind the scenes comes into it, where sometimes I get these previews on questions. And so I start to think about them. And then you ask the question and I'm like, ooh, you edited that since we talked. Right? And so I'm like, oh, the best investment I've made in my career.
I think we were on the plane home from Christmas in St. Martin when I was like going through new questions I was thinking about when I might have asked you that. So yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to find a way to work in the answer that I wanted to share into this. I think that the best investment I made in myself, and if I think about it, it has paid off in my career as well, but it wasn't designed to be a career investment. And it's the fact that when I was a junior in college, I decided that I was going to do a sort of mini study abroad experience. And I spent 6 weeks in Paris. And as someone whose parents had never even left the country at that point, it was a huge step, and it was a huge kind of opportunity to see that the world existed beyond what I knew on the western half of the United States. And as much as it wasn't designed to be a career investment necessarily, as a 21-year-old, I don't think that's what I was thinking about. I do think that that's been such a critical part of me feeling like I can try things that maybe I wouldn't have felt like I could have tried if I hadn't done that and had it work out. I guess if I'd gotten lost in Paris forever or something, maybe I wouldn't have felt that way. But I did come home. And then, later on when I had opportunities.
We've been to Paris multiple times. So,
that's right. So when I had an opportunity to move to DC and take a next step, moving across the country didn't seem like something that was impossible to do, even though it wasn't anything anyone in my family had ever done.
Yeah, no. You and I have talked about that a ton, right? Like, is the experiences we've had that we maybe didn't have growing up in those first steps. And we talked about the experience Crosby gets because of that. We'll see how that shapes him, right? So I was excited to ask you this. I have a question about building leadership teams. This is another one of these that I believe comes from 3 years of this podcast and talking to leaders and talking about the teams and things like that. We talk about culture a lot, but I'd like to take that a step back to the beginning of it. When you're building that team, what are you trying to find? What are the characteristics you're looking for? And I guess really what plays into that decision-making process?
Mm-hmm. So this is an interesting one for me because I would say that what I looked for in my last 2 hires is not what I'll look for in my next hire because I value the ability to add diverse strengths, traits, and characteristics to what we have. As I thought through this more, though, yes, that's true. And yes, I will be looking for different traits, characteristics, backgrounds, and skills from my next hire. But what I need when I hire somebody and what I need to look for is I need people who can trust me. They don't need to trust me from the interview. They don't need to trust me on their first day when they show up, but they need to demonstrate that they have the capacity to trust me. And maybe that sounds funny. Maybe that sounds like a flip, because maybe most people would say, well, I need to know I can trust them. The thing about it is, and maybe this is because, it's a smaller company or because it's in many ways a startup, what we're doing with Humanidei, but I need people who trust me enough to say, I want to understand your vision and I want to see how I can be part of that. And I need people who can trust me enough that if things aren't coming easily, they can tell, they feel comfortable saying, I'm struggling with this right now, and know that I'll partner with them to get to a place of success. Because I think when your people don't trust you or have that ability to trust you, it can lead to situations where there's miscommunication and you don't really know what's going on, and performance may not be as good as when there is that presence of trust in the organization.
Okay, so I'm digging into this more. Jill just
Your
looking at my
face is
face
telling me I'm answering this question wrong. No, I'm just kidding.
You weren't answering it wrong, but it was, there's so many more questions. And like, I'll be honest here, over the past few years, you, Humanidei and O'Rourke, but you in particular have hired our CEO at CUInsight. You've hired our last 4 employees. You've worked with the employees that were there before we hired the CEO. So what you're saying makes a ton of sense just from the conversations that you had with David and I, even before we hired Lauren. And it was that idea of, we had a lot of amazing people that applied for the gig, but we had to feel comfortable that they got our vision and that they understood what we've always tried to do with CUInsight, right? Like, so how do you, when you're building, I'm just going back to the original question, when you're building that team, when whether you're talking about Humanidei, whether you're talking about CUInsight, whether you're talking about one of the many credit unions that you work with, how in that process, before they're on board, do you, like, you've done very well for us. I'll just say that. But like, how do you get through all of that and all of the people prepare for interviews to really be able to decide that, wow, okay, this person trusts me, believes in me, believes in the organization, and, and it's not just maybe another job or something like that. They're a good fit. Does that question make sense? Or?
It does. And it's, it's very different when I'm looking at hiring someone to join my team and I'm measuring that, okay, does it feel like this person is going to be able to trust me? Maybe versus if I'm hiring someone to go work for Lauren, and it's harder for me to say, oh, like, cause I'm sitting there, I have sort of this implicit expectation of trust, right? So if I'm talking to somebody, I'm like, well, of course you're going to trust Lauren. But with me, I trust Lauren. You should trust Lauren. She's very trustworthy, right? But like, if I'm working with somebody who's joining my team, maybe I'm looking for something different. So I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this. I don't think he would, but Carl Clark, who was the last hire we had at the organization, he was essentially a stranger to me. I knew of him through credit union space, through the credit union where he had worked, but I didn't know him. We were not familiar with one another. And as we were going through the interview process, he shared with me that he had asked around. It's just a small enough system. We have mutual acquaintances, and that he had done his research on not just Humanidei, but on me as a leader as well, and had read writing I had done or read articles that were out there, or had asked people who knew me what their impressions were and their reputation.
Those articles were probably on CUInsight.com.
They might have been. They might have been on CUInsight.
Little plug for us over here. So.
But to me, what that told me was that as Carl was making a decision, he was looking for a leader who he needed to have some values alignment with, or he needed to have something with. And to me, that showed, again, it didn't mean he trusted me from day one, but it definitely demonstrated to me that capacity for trust, that expectation that there would be values alignment with a leader, that expectation that the leader would be a partner to him and not someone who there would be like any sort of negative relationship between, or
Good job, Carl. So I'm going to take the flip side of that question, right? Like, is there something that's just a no-go that shuts you down when you're talking to somebody to come on board at an organization? Because you talk to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. If it feels adversarial to me, it is really hard for me to come back from. And that's true, certainly, if I'm interviewing somebody to work with me, we work with my team. But that's even the case if I'm interviewing somebody as the recruiter and the candidate is like rude to us as recruiters, it makes me say, like, because by this point in the time, like if we're recruiting, by this point, we know we've worked with the board. We've typically interviewed the senior leaders in the organization. Like we're starting to care about these people who work for the organization. And if somebody comes in and treats me or someone on my team in a way that's not, I mean, it's certainly disrespectful or unkind would be problematic, but even just kind of the, like, just that adversarial thing, like it treats it like we're not on the same side. It makes me say, gosh, do I want to trust this organization that I've come to love with you if you're coming at things? And maybe that is just that other side to that coin of trust, because that coming in an adversarial manner is sort of the opposite of that implicit belief in trust. It's that like, okay, it's me against you. And to me, it's, we should be in partnership here. So
it reminds me of the old dating adage, let's just say, where it's like on the first date, watch how they treat the wait staff, right?
Yes, absolutely, right?
So this, again, another question that I've just, put in for this year because it's something that, it's been intriguing to learn over time, I guess. Let's put it that way. But now that you have your team, and I'm thinking about all the CEOs who have been on the show over the years, and it's one of these questions I'd love to have them back to ask the question, but like, how do you give feedback? Could you give an example, and you don't have to mention any names, but where you were disappointed in, say, the outcome or the performance of somebody on your team? What was the feedback that you gave, and how did it turn out? What are those hacks you've picked up over the years, right?
I don't know if they're hacks or if they're just sort of natural tendencies, but I am a question asker. And this was I don't think he listens to the podcast, so I could tell stories about Crosby's dad, right? Where when I say questions, I don't mean what the hell were you thinking? Right. Which, Crosby shared with me was one that comes out sometimes in
What do you mean Dave doesn't listen to the podcast? Come on, Dave, pull together.
I guess we'll know after this one if he does. But
that's right.
So when I say something happens and you're trying to figure out what the root of it was and I ask questions, those questions are not, what the hell were you thinking? What happened there? But kind of a, what's going on? And I really take two approaches on it. So one is sort of like, what happened in the situation? Like what was going on there? What did you need? What didn't you have? My expectation is that people want to do a good job. Like No one shows up for work being like, you know what I'd like to do is phone it in and be mediocre. Like that's not anyone's goal, I don't think. And so if something happens and my expectations weren't met, the first kind of line of questioning is, are we on the same page about what the expectations were? Do we share the understanding of the expectations? And do you have the resources to meet those expectations? The other line of questioning, the one I typically use first, is like, how are you personally? And particularly in this last 24 months, I don't know, like it is so easy to make a mistake right now because of how distracted we are about everything else in the world going on. And so the first place that I have a tendency to go to is, are you okay? Like, is there something we need to do? Once we get to that point of like, all right, the human is all right. Now let's go down the path of, were you clear on what the expectations were? Did you have the resources for the expectation? What's your game plan so it doesn't happen again?
Anybody who's listened to this podcast and heard me say, tell me more. That comes directly from Jill. She does like to ask more questions. So a question for you, and I'm smiling as I ask this one. What do you think makes a good CEO or a leader in general?
As you know, I'm a certified executive coach, and we use this tool called the Harrison Assessment. And the Harrison Assessment actually uses like predictive analytics to figure out what makes a good CEO. So I'm trying not to get too textbooky on it, but I'll tell you that the top 2 traits that come out of that, I'm like, that makes a lot of sense. So one is like takes initiatives, understand what needs to be done and can get it done. That's pretty critical. The second one though, that comes up in those top traits and is the one that is again, kind of like obviously, but wants to lead. And wants to lead is defined as the desire to be in a position where you guide the performance of others. And it's funny how many people get into their first leadership position and say, whoops, nope, didn't want that, because it's different having to be in that position or choosing to be in that position of guiding or directing the performance of others compared to that position of being able to make your contributions at your highest possible level and do a great job with that. And you have to love that role where you get to help guide others and help lead them and help coach them. And so that actual desire to lead is probably the most important trait that makes a good CEO.
Oh, and that is why Dave and I needed a CEO, right? Like, so we enjoyed the innovative part and the building and doing it on our own, but Robbie and John, who have been there all along, can tell you it's really nice to have a CEO, actually, who's a good leader and not just us doing what we did, which we had a good time doing it. But this is another one of these questions that I've added so many for the coming year that have really come from past shows and just like conversations where it's like, I'd like to hear more about that from people. But one of the things that we've noticed over the past couple of years is credit unions do have the ability to move pretty quick.
Yeah.
Like they've really done a great job to serve their members over the past few years. So the question that I have is, how do you move fast or pivot when something isn't working or when the business changes? And I'll take it from two different sides. Sometimes the whole business changes. But the place that I'd really love to dig into is like when you have that great idea that just doesn't work. Many times over the past 13, 14 years of CUInsight, we've had amazing ideas that didn't work. But like, so that idea of how do you move past those? How do you kill a project? Like, how do you not get married to an idea because you think it's perfect when, maybe your members or the marketplace is telling you that it's not?
Mm-hmm. I think that being a good CEO is not becoming too dogmatic about one's own ideas. And so even if you're the one who gives birth to the idea, maybe making sure you're not the one who raises that idea too is important. And if you do have a great idea, and if you do roll out that great idea, pay attention to what surrounds the idea. So if working on this project is causing your greatest people to be burnt out, or, that's something that should raise a red flag on that. So, not just looking at something for the sake of like, well, this is meant to work, so let's double down, let's add more resources, let's invest more into it, but being able to actually see what's the spirit around this idea, what's the energy around this idea, and what are the costs of continuing to pursue it? And I think if you analyze something that way, I wouldn't say it's easy to abandon something that you thought was going to be a great idea and you expected it to work. But if you can recognize that the cost of continuing to persist and recognize that perhaps that cost is outweighing the potential benefit or the realized benefit of it, then it makes it easier to walk away from that. And I think, again, going back to that idea of the not being dogmatic with it, just making sure that you are never the only one who takes ownership of an idea or a project. That way somebody else has the ability to come in and say, yeah, this really isn't working, without it feeling like they are, telling you your baby's ugly in that situation.
Okay. So I've got two more questions on the leadership section, and I have now realized that I added way too many new questions here. I mean, this is going to become like a serial podcast where, you need 5 episodes. So 2 more on the leadership question before we have some fun with the rapid fire questions. So the first one was one that's come up often, and it's that conversation around navigating the board. And I've thought about this from a, kind of a 2 sides perspective. And it's that idea of like, how do you navigate that board member or even a team member, right? Maybe it's somebody that's on your leadership team who has that opinion that their way is the right way. They may have good intentions. And I'm sure you've had to deal with this in your, and navigate through this maze in your career. For the person out there that's maybe either a new leader and hasn't led a team before, or for that CEO, right, who's dealing with maybe a board for the first time, how do you navigate that board member who thinks that their way is the only way?
So Again, I am a big fan of questions, right? So in that case, like I think about it and I think about the perspective I had in this case, not in my current role, but as the CEO of a trade association where you have a very diverse group of members and your board is representing these diverse members, but also serving as the CEO of their own credit union for which they have their own interests, right? And so when you think about somebody coming in and saying, well, this is what we need to do, this is how we need to do it. And maybe you can recognize that yeah, they're wearing their board member hat, but they're also wearing their individual hat. So in the case of a credit union member, they have their own finances with the credit union. They have their own financial needs with the credit union. They have their own
career,
their own community needs and community desires. But they also recognize, I think for the most part, people know that they're there not just for their own interests, but for representing this great group. And so some of the types of questions that I would ask in that situation would be, okay, I understand why you think this is a great idea. I see your perspective on this, but can you imagine, if somebody objected to this, why might someone disagree with you? Like, who would be someone who wouldn't see it your way? What would that be? And stepping through that, and particularly in the case of a board member, but helping them to think about it from the perspective of the other stakeholders they represent as well. And most of the time, they'll at least be able to say, okay, I could understand why somebody else might object to this. I can see another perspective from this. And maybe my idea is still right. Maybe my idea is still the best thing for the greatest number of people, but at least it gives them that opportunity to kind of pause and reflect and maybe even say, gosh, I'll go out and ask somebody who has different interests than me and at least get another perspective coming into that too.
Oh, that's good stuff there. You're making me smarter. So last question in this section. Many people over the past couple of years have realized that work, and I'm doing air quotes, is not that physical place, right? Most credit unions were skeptical about remote work pre-pandemic, as were many other businesses. It's not like credit unions were alone there. What does a career in credit unions look like moving forward?
I think that's still to be determined. I think credit unions are still working through this. The retail branch presence is still important. There won't be credit unions that are 100% remote when they have retail branch presence. There have been moves though, even some, there's been some remote tellers, some virtual tellers. Crosby got a pretty cool virtual reality toy for Christmas. And I was laughing. I was laughing because there's an element to it for virtual conference rooms on there. And then it's like, well, maybe. And it was reminding me that many years ago, there was this like, ooh, maybe we'll have holograms. And so people can meet via hologram with their branch representative.
It might be just glasses that we're wearing, right? Yeah.
From an anecdotal, I'm hearing credit unions saying, okay, we'll let our mid-managers work remotely according to how they want to. But once you hit the C-suite, you have to be on site. That's a requirement we're having. If you're a teller, you have to be live because that's the way we serve our members. So I think we'll probably be in this hybrid environment for the foreseeable future.
See how it shakes out, eh?
Yeah.
All right. So a little bit of fun.
All right.
Some rapid fire questions. It wouldn't be the CUInsight Experience without it. Some of them I'm going to skip over and just say, listen to Jill being on the show before, because I'm not going to ask her to answer it twice. But a new question in the rapid fire. When was the last time you were amazed, either personally or professionally? And this 100% comes from conversations that we've had over the past couple of months. So
yeah, gosh, I don't know. When was the last time I was amazed? Probably today. That's the whole conversation we had was around the idea that I think that, people sort of live on a spectrum of being able to be amazed and something that it's kind of, I like how much I like people. I like how curious I am. And I like the fact that I'm still pretty easily amazed. Like I've seen a lot of the world, but it doesn't fail to still pleasantly amaze me with what I continue to see out in the world.
I don't think you answered my question.
When was the last time I was amazed? I said today.
Oh, what was it?
What was it?
What amazed you? What was something that amazed you recently?
So, this is like, I get amazed by the big things. We've had some amazing travel experiences, but today I'm amazed by the way Crosby's little engineering mind works. And so the fact that
just this evening before we recorded this.
So he spends a lot more time watching YouTube than I'd like him to, but every now and then he can dig in deep to a project and he'll end up spending, a lot of quiet, focused time and come out with something that it really worked. So today it was the quarter launcher. And
he created something that launched quarters between two hotel keys we had brought back for him. So
I am not of the engineering mind. So it amazes me that his works that way pretty consistently.
So what have you learned along the way to create some balance? I mean, as one of the things that we've talked a lot about on this podcast is that often leaders can get pretty consumed by the organizations that they're leading. And that can be at the detriment of family and personal life and other things. So what have you learned along the way to create balance in life?
I feel like, can I put this one back on you? Can I ask you what I've learned along the way? Because in this case, I'm sure none of your other guests will do this to you, but in this case, we are family. So how am I doing with it? You tell me.
You're doing a very good job, and you've become much better at actually blocking the time off. So you work harder than anybody I know, but you'll also block time off to not. So I think you're doing a fantastic job, my love.
Thank you. No, and I do think that's key to it, right? Is that especially in this world right now, we hear it all the time that with people working from home more, working remotely more, the lines are blurred. And so being able to say, okay, I'm actually disconnecting, cutting this off, blocking this out for, whatever, whether it's after 5:30 or it's a whole weekend or it's for an entire week away from the office for vacation. I think that's really important.
I think it is now more than ever. That's true. What's the best piece of advice you ever received? And do you remember who gave it to you?
Yeah, I think it's probably a rerun on the podcast. I think I've shared it before. The piece I go back to, and I've received a ton of great advice over my life, but the piece I go back to the most often is when I was probably only had been working for about a year and I was having a challenge where I wanted to do more. I wanted to try more. I had lots of ideas, and I had a manager at the time who was like, ooh, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. And Tracy was the CEO of the organization. And she said, let the chips fall, kind of do your best, put your things out there, give some trying. And if you think there's going to be consequences, just let the chips fall and see what's going to happen. And nothing happened bad at the time. I only had good things come from trying at that point. And so when I find myself sort of being hesitant about trying something new, that's the advice that goes through my head now too.
Let the chips fall. So I dig the idea, and this is another one of these that probably came from you in a subliminal way, but of having a mission and not a job. What's Jill's personal mission statement?
So thank you to the Salem, Oregon Chamber of Commerce on a workshop that I went through there for Leadership Salem circa, 2009, 2010, maybe. My personal mission is help others reach their full potential.
I knew that answer. I'm going to skip over what's the greatest album of all time. The first time you were on the podcast, I know that was a question that gave you the most stress, so people have to listen back. But I am going to ask you, what are you currently reading? I know you always have a book or three going. And is there that one book right now? I'm not going to go all time because you've been on the show before and you've answered this, but is there that book right now you think everyone should read?
So this might be it.
Okay.
And it's the one that I'm currently reading or kind of coming close to wrapping up on. And also it's one that I'm like, ooh, we all could spend some time with that one. So my friend, the always inspiring John Bissell, the CEO at Greylock Federal Credit Union up in Western Massachusetts, recommended a book called The Sum of Us by Heather McGee. It's not light reading, but it's good reading and it's inspiring reading. And any of us who work in financial services especially will gain a lot from spending some time reading that book about systemic racism and the long-term effects that continue to have and on everyone in society, how it's bad for all of us to be in a society where racism exists.
I'm still going to ask you the question. Who is it today? When you hear the word success, who's the first person that's coming to mind?
I didn't think you were going to ask me this question, so I'm unprepared.
I only skipped the greatest album of all time question.
I know. So she's probably going to be embarrassed that I say this, but right now you say it, and the person who's coming to mind is Samantha Paxson.
Tell me more.
And part of the reason for that is because she had the greatest answer of all time to this question on your podcast. And they'll have to go back and listen to her episode to know what it is. But
I agree with that completely.
And Sam and I have known each other since we were in this.
Sam wanted me to remove that question afterwards, and I know she won't. So that's right. Yeah.
We've known each other since we were in this Young Leaders for Kids group, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. And Sam did an amazing job creating the Think conference back then, but her career trajectory has continued to be incredible, and she's inspiring, and she does a great job mentoring other people. So yeah, she's the first person who's coming to mind, but not just because of her answer on that. It's well-deserved. She's done a tremendous job with her life and her career.
Yeah, all are going to have to scroll way back. I think she was
episode 10.
Yeah, she was episode 10. I was going to say first 10 episodes, but yeah, you're right. She was episode 10. So scroll back, listen to Sam, give her some listens. Find out her answer. You have to listen to the whole thing to get it. So, because it's one of the last questions. But anyways, there you go. That's it. Thank you so much, Jill, for being on the show. I greatly appreciate you spending the time with me today. If people have additional questions from you, what's the best way to find you?
The best way to reach me is by email. So Jill@Humanidei.com.
We will link to that in the show notes, plus all your socials and all that good stuff too. So thank you again for being here today, which is actually tonight. It's now 10 p.m. on a Sunday. A few things before we go. Make sure to check out Humanidei in the show notes and see all the great work Jill and her team are doing. I am grateful for their support of the podcast and so much more at CUInsight. They've brought us amazing team members and helped us in all our strategic planning and everything else. And they also allow me to have this much fun doing what I do. So thank you again to Humanidei. Please also subscribe to the CUInsight Experience on your favorite podcast player. We're on all of them. And while you're there, I would sure appreciate a 5-star review. It helps with the visibility of the show. And also, if you're looking for any of the books that have been mentioned on this show today with Jill or any of the past shows, a quick Google of the CUInsight Experience book list, and you'll find your next read, and you can have it on its way from Amazon. But certainly, last but not least, I want to thank all of you for listening. Y'all rock, and I appreciate the kind words that come in about the show. Please be well, friends, and I hope to see you all soon.